Before we begin, subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who thinks the old frontier forts kept nothing behind but dust and old timber. Drop a comment when you finish and tell me if you think the last men out of that gate walked out whole. Now turn the lights down, put your headphones in, and let me tell you what I found in the private correspondence of a post-surgeon who served out the final winter at a fort the army was closing for good. Part 1. The Closing Order. I am not going to give you the real name of the fort, partly because the descendants of some of the men in this account are still alive, and partly because the historical society that eventually acquired the surviving papers has asked, quietly, that certain identifying details stay out of public retellings. I will tell you it stood on the high plains, in the kind of open, windswept country where a man can see a storm coming from 30 miles off and still not have time to get ready for it, and that by the late 1880s, it had outlived its purpose the way so many of those old frontier posts did. Once the railroad made the wagon trails obsolete and the tribes who had once made that country contested ground had been pushed onto reservations far from the fort's original reason for existing. The order came down from the War Department in the autumn. The fort would close by the following spring. Most of the garrison would transfer out immediately, move to postings further east or further west depending on need. A small detachment would remain through the winter, skeleton crew, there to guard the buildings and the remaining stores until the final auction could be arranged and the last men could walk out the gate for good. 22 men were chosen for that final winter posting. A captain nearing the end of a long, undistinguished career, counting down the months until his own retirement. 2 lieutenants, both young, both eager to prove themselves on what they assumed would be an uneventful, forgettable assignment. A post-surgeon, a careful, methodical man whose private letters and daybook form the backbone of everything I am about to tell you. And an old civilian scout, a man who had lived on and around that post for over 3 decades, who knew the surrounding country better than anyone else alive, and who had, according to every surviving account, tried quietly and unsuccessfully to warn the captain against accepting the winter posting at all. Part 2. The Scout's Warning. The scout's name, in the surviving letters, is given only as Old Benjoy, a nickname the garrison had used for him for so long that even his given name had mostly fallen out of use. He had come to that stretch of plains as a young man, decades before the fort itself was ever built, and had lived through enough winters out there to have developed, in the words of the post-surgeon's own letters, quote, an instinct for trouble that no younger man on this post, myself included, has yet earned the right to question, end quote. According to the surgeon's letters, Old Benjoy approached the captain directly in early October, shortly after the closing orders were announced, and asked, as plainly as a civilian scout was permitted to ask a commanding officer anything, that the winter garrison be reduced to the absolute minimum required, and that under no circumstances should any detail be sent to work the ground near what he referred to only as the low draw, a shallow depression in the earth roughly 6 miles northwest of the fort, out past the last of the grazing land, where the surrounding grass grew thin and pale in a way that did not match the healthier grass surrounding it. The captain, by every surviving account a practical, unimaginative man with little patience for what he considered frontier superstition, dismissed the request without much consideration, noting in the post log only that the scout had raised, quote, certain concerns regarding local terrain, deemed not actionable, end quote. Old Benjoy did not raise the subject again directly with the captain after that. But according to the surgeon's letters, he spoke of it privately, at length, with anyone on the post willing to listen, describing a story that had been passed down among the older civilian families and remaining tribal contacts in that region for longer than anyone still living could account for. A story about a presence that had occupied that low draw long before any fort, any wagon trail, any settlement had ever come to that stretch of plains, something the older stories referred to only by a name that did not translate cleanly into English, though the surgeon's letters record one rough approximation that had stayed with him enough to write down, a name that translated, as closely as he could manage, to something like the one who was already here. The stories, as Old Benjoy told them, did not describe this presence as actively cruel or predatory in the way of a monster from a child's tale. They described it instead as patient, territorial in a slow, generational way, content to remain dormant and unnoticed for years or even decades at a time, but prone, Whenever the balance of a place shifted significantly enough, whenever the people living nearby grew too confident, too settled, too certain that the land belonged fully to them, to reassert, deliberately and without hurry, exactly whose ground it actually was. Part 3. The first disappearance. The first sign that old Benjoy's warnings deserved more than the captain's initial dismissal came in the second week of November, when a private named Josiah Kane rode out alone toward the low draw to check on a section of fence line that bordered the fort's grazing land, a routine task he had performed dozens of times without incident. His horse returned to the fort alone late that evening, saddle and bridle intact, reins trailing but undamaged, showing no sign of having run in panic or struggled against anything. Kane himself was never found, despite an extensive search of the surrounding area over the following days that turned up no tracks, no equipment, no indication of what had happened to him at all. The post-surgeon's daybook entries from that period describe a captain increasingly reluctant to entertain any explanation beyond simple desertion, a conclusion the surviving men on the post found difficult to accept given Kane's long service record and the complete absence of any indication he had planned to leave. Old Benjoy, for his part, said little publicly after Kane's disappearance, though the surgeon records a private conversation in which the old scout stated, with what the surgeon describes as an unsettling flatness, that Kane had likely ridden closer to the low draw than his assigned duties required, and that the presence occupying that ground had simply, quote, reminded him where the boundary actually sits, end quote. Part 4. The growing unease. Over the following weeks, the surgeon's daybook records a pattern of small, individually explainable but collectively unsettling occurrences across the fort. Men reporting difficulty sleeping, describing a persistent, low pressure in the ears that several compared to the feeling of a storm building on the horizon, though the weather itself remained unremarkable. A dog belonging to one of the sergeants, previously a fearless, active animal, began refusing to venture near the northwest corner of the parade ground after dark, a section of open ground that, the surgeon notes almost in passing, sat in the general direction of the low draw. More troubling still were the accounts of men hearing their own names called from empty stretches of the fort grounds, always at night, always from a direction that seemed to shift depending on where the listener stood, in voices that several men separately described, with obvious discomfort, as sounding almost, but not quite, correct, like a familiar voice heard through a wall too thick to carry it cleanly. The surgeon, a careful and by his own description skeptical man, records struggling throughout this period to reconcile his professional training with what he was personally observing and hearing secondhand from men he considered reliable, sober witnesses. One entry from late November reads, in language he later crossed out but which remains legible beneath the strike marks, quote, I find myself, against every instinct my training has given me, beginning to understand why old Benjoy speaks of that ground the way a man speaks of a debt he knows will eventually come due, end quote. Part 5. The second disappearance. The second man lost that winter was a corporal named Aldous Reyes, who vanished under circumstances even more unsettling than Kane's disappearance a month earlier. Reyes had been part of a small detail sent to gather firewood from a stand of timber close to the fort's main buildings, well within sight of the walls, in broad daylight, with two other men present. According to the sworn statements later collected by the captain, Reyes had been standing beside the wagon, in plain view of both his companions, for no more than the span of a few minutes while the other two men loaded cut wood. When one of them turned to ask him a question, Reyes was simply gone. His rifle remained propped against the wagon exactly where he had left it. There were no tracks leading away from that spot in the thin snow covering the ground that day, in any direction, despite ground conditions that should have preserved a clear trail regardless of which way he had gone. This second disappearance, occurring so close to the fort itself and witnessed by two reliable men, finally forced the captain to take old Benjoy's earlier warning seriously, though by the surgeon's account, his change in attitude came from fear rather than genuine understanding. The captain ordered a full search of the surrounding grounds, extending, for the first time that winter, all the way out to the low draw itself. Part 6. What they found at the draw. Old Benjoy led the search party out to the draw personally, along with the surgeon, the sergeant of the guard, and 4 privates, a decision the surgeon's letters suggest the old scout made reluctantly, motivated more by a sense that someone needed to properly understand what they were dealing with than by any confidence that going there would actually help. The draw itself, when they reached it, presented as an unremarkable shallow depression in the plain, ringed by a low natural rise that kept it hidden from view until a person was almost directly upon it. At its center, however, the ground differed noticeably from the surrounding grassland, a roughly circular patch of bare, pale earth some 30 feet across, entirely devoid of the grass and sage that grew everywhere else in that section of plains, as though something about that particular patch of ground refused, consistently, to support ordinary growth. At the center of that bare circle, the search party found a stone, partially embedded in the earth, its surface marked with what the surgeon's letters describe as bands of regular, deliberate-looking patterns that none of the men present could confidently attribute to natural weathering. Accounts of the stone's exact size and appearance vary considerably between the different men's later statements, a discrepancy the surgeon notes with clear unease in his own writing, observing that it was as though each man who looked directly at the stone came away with a slightly different, equally certain impression of what he had actually seen. Old Benjoy would not approach the stone directly, and advised the rest of the party against touching it as well. He told the surgeon afterward, in a conversation recorded in careful detail, that the stone itself was not the true source of the danger, only a marker, a threshold of sorts, and that whatever occupied the ground beneath it had been resting there, largely undisturbed, for far longer than any structure built by settlers on that plain, and that the fort's presence nearby, and now its impending closure, had disturbed a balance that had held quietly for generations. Part 7. The Surgeon's Private Theory. In the weeks following the discovery at the draw, the surgeon's daybook entries grow increasingly detailed and increasingly troubled, reflecting his own attempt to reconcile what he had witnessed with some framework he could personally accept. He records extensive conversations with old Benjoy, piecing together a working theory that the scout himself, by his own admission, had never fully proven, only inherited from generations of older stories he trusted enough not to dismiss. The theory, as the surgeon eventually recorded it in full, held that certain places accumulate a kind of long, patient attention from something that predates any human presence on that land, something that remains dormant for extended periods but grows more active, more assertive, whenever the humans living nearby begin to treat the land as fully and permanently theirs, particularly during moments of significant change, arrival, expansion, or, as was happening that winter, departure. The surgeon wrote, in an entry from mid-December that he later marked with a private notation indicating he never intended it for anyone else's eyes, quote, "I begin to suspect that our closing of this post, our preparation to abandon ground we once claimed so confidently, has been read by whatever occupies that draw not as a retreat, but as an invitation, a final opportunity, before the last of us are gone, to reclaim what it considers rightfully its own," end quote. Part. The final weeks. 2 more men were lost before the winter's end, a private who vanished during a routine overnight guard shift with no witnesses at all, and, most disturbing of all according to the surviving accounts, one of the young lieutenants, who disappeared from his own quarters overnight, his boots and coat left neatly beside his bed, the door to his room found securely locked from the inside the following morning, requiring it to be forced open before anyone could confirm he was gone. The captain, by this point a visibly diminished man according to the surgeon's letters, ordered no further search parties sent out, choosing instead simply to hold the remaining garrison as tightly together as possible, doubling guard shifts, forbidding any man from venturing alone to any part of the grounds after dark, and counting, with what the surgeon describes as grim, silent determination, the remaining weeks until the closing date finally arrived. Old Benjoy, in the final weeks before the fort's official closure, grew increasingly withdrawn, spending most nights sitting alone near the main gate with his rifle across his knees, watching the dark plains beyond the walls with an intensity the surgeon found more unsettling than reassuring. He told the surgeon, in one of their last recorded conversations, that he believed the disappearances would stop entirely once the fort was fully abandoned and the last of the men had gone, that whatever occupied the draw had never wanted the buildings or the land itself, only the confirmation, repeated across each loss, that the humans who had settled there understood, finally and completely, exactly whose ground they had always been standing on. Part 9. The departure. The fort closed on schedule in early spring, the surviving members of that final garrison marching out through the main gate for the last time under a clear, cold sky. The surgeon's final daybook entry from that post, dated the morning of their departure, describes a quiet, uneventful march out, no incident, no further loss, the remaining buildings left standing empty behind them as the last wagons pulled away down the old trail. Old Benjoy did not march out with the rest of the garrison. According to the surgeon's account, the old scout was gone from his usual post near the gate on the morning of departure, his few personal belongings left behind in an orderly, deliberate manner that suggested he had not been taken the way the others had, but had chosen, quietly and without explanation, to remain behind on his own. A single note, in the scout's own unsteady handwriting, was found among his belongings, addressed to no one in particular, reading only, quote, "Someone ought to stay and watch it settle back to sleep, and I have watched this ground longer than any man left standing here. Do not come looking," end quote. No search was ever conducted for old Benjoy. The surgeon's letters, written years later from a quiet medical practice far removed from the frontier, record a private conviction, never stated publicly, that the old scout's decision to remain had been, in its own way, a kind of trade, an old man's final attempt to satisfy whatever debt that ground still felt was owed, so that no one else would have to. Part 10. What remains? The fort's buildings stood empty for years afterward before eventually falling into the slow disrepair common to so many abandoned frontier posts, several structures dismantled for lumber, others left to weather and collapse on their own. The low draw 6 miles northwest of the original site remains, to this day, according to a handful of local accounts collected decades later, a patch of ground that local ranchers still quietly avoid working after dark, for reasons most of them, when asked directly, struggle to articulate beyond a vague, inherited sense that some places are simply better left alone. The surgeon's daybook, along with his private letters, eventually made their way into a regional historical archive, where they remain available today to anyone willing to search them out, alongside a small handwritten note the surgeon apparently attached before his death, reading only that the account was true as far as his own careful observation could confirm it, and that he offered no apology for how difficult it might be for a modern reader to believe. If this story does not convince you that some ground remembers exactly who it belongs to, no matter how many walls we build across it or how confidently we eventually walk away, then I do not think any story will. But I would ask you this. The next time you stand on open, quiet land, out where the grass thins for no obvious reason and the wind seems to carry just a little further than it should, I would ask you to listen carefully to whatever silence follows, and to trust it completely. Thank you for listening to the whole thing. Like this video if it gave you chills, share it with someone who has ever felt watched on open ground, and subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Drop a comment and tell me whether you think old Benjoy ever truly rested. I read every single one of them. I will see you in the next video. Until then, sleep well if you can, and remember whose ground you are really standing on.